It's not fair. That's been a kid anthem, I think, as long as there have been kids. The kid version of It's Not Fair is, oh, my brother got a bigger piece of the apple pie. Or the sister that says, well, when I was that age, I didn't get to da-da-da-da-da-da. It's not fair. There's a grown-up version of It's Not Fair, and as you get older, it gets a little more serious than just apple pie and somebody who got a later curfew. There's an adult American version that can even be reflected in news that came out this week about a man named Jaden Ivey. Jaden Ivey used to be a Chicago Bulls basketball player, and all of that ended Monday as the team waived him for conduct detrimental to the team. And you say, what terrible thing did Ivey do that was detrimental to the team? Did he mock the leadership? Did he, was he proven to be a criminal? Was he shoplifting in stores? What terrible thing did Ivey do that got him waived in the NBA? What terrible thing he did was to get on social media and say this about the upcoming Pride events that are going to go throughout the NBA, and particularly through the Chicago Bulls. He said, the world can proclaim LGBTQ, right? They proclaim Pride Month, and the NBA, they proclaim it. They show it to the world. They say, come join us for Pride Month to celebrate unrighteousness. They proclaim it on the billboards. They proclaim it in the streets, unrighteousness. And the result to that statement was that he has now been fired. Now, I don't know anything else about Jaden Ivey. I don't think I'd ever heard his name until this hit the news. I don't know where he really stands with Christ, with the gospel. All I know is that he dared to say that what the world is doing in celebrating Pride Month is unrighteousness. And in fact, there was further news today as the mainstream media picked up the story, and they said, far from learning his lesson, Ivey has actually doubled down. He's doubled down because he made some additional posts. And in his additional post, he said that he was full of things like joy and peace, while people without Christ only have emptiness. He said things like all those rings that Steph Curry got, all those rings that LeBron has, all those rings that Michael Jordan has, on Judgment Day, they won't matter at all. And the media said, how dare he say such things? How dare he attack the great Michael Jordan? He said things like, God didn't make us to sleep with 15 different women, and all these guys that are going and partying throughout the NBA, they're trying to fill a void that only Jesus can fill. Again, I don't know any of the rest of the story. I don't know where he is at, but it certainly looks from the outset to be unjust that of all the things that an NBA player has ever been fired for, that be what somebody gets fired for. For all of the professional athletes that have done a whole number of legitimately evil and wicked things and not been fired, it seems unjust. The adult American version of injustice seems to us to be, it's unfair. That's not right. There's a global version of unjust suffering. We see it in our world, even throughout the violence in the Middle East. I got an email this week from a man that I consider to be a modern missionary hero. He shared this story that I want to share with you, and it just feels unjust. This is his email from yesterday. The attacks have picked up again in recent days. Wednesday evening, as I was teaching a class, my lecture was interrupted by a series of 4 to 5 explosions that shook the building. Later, I learned that some of the explosions had been very close to our house, 5 miles away, with shrapnel falling into our next-door neighbor's yard. The last couple of days have seen an increased number of attacks in other parts of the UAE. In apparent response to Iranian threats this morning, the government issued a COVID-style edict against services and worship gatherings. Because we don't control our own buildings, when the government shuts down our access to buildings, we don't have any choice in the matter. So no Good Friday services, probably no Easter services on Sunday. We're all scrambling, trying to pull together house meetings, online teachings, etc. We are determined to celebrate the resurrection together one way or the other. We're disappointed to not meet on Good Friday. But something about an evil terrorist regime threatening to blow up churches feels very appropriate to Good Friday. When you read an email like that, you think, but that's not just. Like, we're sitting here in comfort and in enjoyment, and there's no threat of this building getting blown up by any regime. And it's not right that we have brothers and sisters that can't celebrate Good Friday because of what a government has done, because what a terrorist government has done, and we feel the sense of unfairness. A missionary friend went on to say this: "It's the day when the devil did his worst, Good Friday, and thought he'd won his great victory. But he didn't win, he still doesn't. Because as they say, Sunday is coming. Jesus is risen, our hope is sure, and Satan's defeat is guaranteed. Evil can create these little hindrances. The toothless tiger can keep raging, but Jesus will keep building his church." As we think about injustice, in our world, the greatest injustice this world has ever done is in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It was the worst miscarriage of justice. It was the most unjustified treatment of an innocent. It was the most ugly demonstration of jealousy, power, pride, and rejection this world has ever seen. And tonight, I want to urge you to value Christ's suffering for you. Value Christ's suffering for you. To do so, we're going to have to consider the nature of unjust suffering. So I want to draw your attention for just a few moments to 1 Peter chapter number 2. 1 Peter chapter number 2. I'm going to read starting in verse number 18. "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God." And then this verse, number 21, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." I'm not suggesting tonight that any of Christ's suffering was in any way unjust on God's part, but wholly and solely on mankind's. And what is our personal posture when we suffer unjustly? We're not talking tonight about how government should rule justly or how the church as a whole should intervene and respond to unjust suffering, but what is our response when we individually suffer unjustly? Peter will walk us through a personal response to unjust suffering that will find its culmination in the suffering of Christ. If we're going to value Christ's suffering, we're going to need to adopt God's view on this matter for ourselves. We need to value Christ's suffering. In order to do that, we need to see value for unjust suffering in God's command. That's in verse number 18. "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect." That word servants is a word that is used for household servants. It's not another New Testament word, the word doulos, which is about a bondslave. This is a word for household servants that would have included doctors and teachers and musicians and actors and craftsmen and managers and other professionals, servants, household servants who are doing a whole number of different employments, a whole number of different jobs. And Peter says to them, be subject to your masters with all respect. That's the command. Now notice he says not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. So he's already moving them in a direction of thinking about unjust suffering. How does he say that these servants should respond to injustice? Does he say rise up against it, overthrow it, try to change the social order, rebel, change society, get rid of the idea of servants? No, he says be subject to your masters, not only the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. Live under it with submission, subject with all respect. There's a value for unjust suffering in God's command that doesn't say overthrow, but instead says be subject with respect. And if we're going to value Christ's suffering for us, we're going to have to understand God's value for submission through suffering, particularly through unjust suffering, because that's really what he does in the next verses. We need to see value for unjust suffering in God's grace. Look in verse number 19. He says, for this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Do you want to know what grace looks like when you actually live it out? What does favor look like when it's lived out? Well, this is a gracious thing if you are suffering unjustly and you are enduring. That's what grace looks like. In fact, it has to mean that, right? If grace is favor that somebody doesn't deserve, then what else meets this criteria? You are suffering unjustly, you're being treated wrongly, you're enduring sorrows, and so what is needed in that moment is grace, because if there was vengeance, if there was perfect justice, then you'd You'd rebel. You wouldn't show favor to these people. And instead he says, this is a gracious thing. This is how God shows his grace to people when they're doing the wrong thing to still be given kindness, to still be treated well. He repeats that, for this is a gracious thing. He says, for what credit is it to you when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? All right? Anybody should be able to do the wrong thing, get beaten for it, and endure through that. But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Exact same expression. This is a gracious thing in verse number 19. This is a gracious thing in verse number 20. If when you do good and you suffer, if you endure through that, that is an expression of grace. That's what it looks like. Peter is changing his readers' perception of themselves in light of unjust suffering. He's telling them you need to look at unjust suffering a particular way. There's a command from God that you need to be submissive and respectful. You need to live out the grace of God. And we look at this and we go, man, that's kind of a raw deal for the servants, right? I mean, that's kind of rough to tell them. He doesn't tell them like, yeah, what's happening to you is terrible. Like, oh, this is awful injustice. We hate injustice, right? We are all the 6-year-old kid that goes, that's not fair. They got a bigger piece of the pie, right? We are all, and Peter doesn't lean into that. He doesn't say like, yeah, you really need to like draw clear lines about what is just and what is unjust. You need to fight for your rights. You need to stand up for yourselves. He says that you actually need to respond with grace. You need to endure as you are suffering unjustly. And he goes, man, Peter, like, how in the world are these servants supposed to do that? I think every single one of us, when we are treated unjustly, there is this natural, innate welling up within us that says, but I don't want you to treat me this way. I don't like this. Like, I didn't do anything wrong. That's what he's clearly saying. Servants, you didn't do anything. If you did something wrong and you were punished for it, well, of course you're going to get punished for it. But you didn't do anything wrong, and now you're being mistreated? And it's one thing for us to receive the due punishment for something we did, but what if we didn't do it? And inside we go like, I don't like that. How could we ever come to grips with suffering unjustly? What could ever make that okay? What could ever make us go, yeah, that's all right. I can endure. I can show grace. And Peter's heading somewhere that we need to head tonight. If we're going to value Christ's suffering, we need to see value for unjust suffering in God's Son. If you're going to value Christ's suffering, here's another piece of the puzzle that you need to understand. Jesus Christ suffered, and he suffered unjustly. We're coming to another Good Friday. For some of you, maybe you have been to literally dozens of Good Friday services. You go and you say, I know we're going to hear about the crucifixion of Jesus. Or you think about his death, but do you realize that you can look at the crucifixion of Jesus again and again and again, and there's always a new way to look at it. There's always a new angle. There's always something else Holy Spirit can drive into your heart. I hope what he'll drive into your heart this evening is that you will value Christ's suffering because he was suffering unjustly. This is a part of what makes our appreciation of this Good Friday. It's another piece of the puzzle that makes us worship and so grateful. You come to verse number 21, and now here's another place in our New Testaments that is gospel-centered. It's not just Paul. This is Peter saying, do you want to figure out how to respond personally to unjust suffering? Then what you need is the gospel. What you need is to understand Jesus. Here's where the application starts of servants being able to do this incredibly hard thing of being submissive with respect and being gracious. It starts in the news about Jesus Christ, our appreciation for the unjust suffering of Christ for us. As Peter's going in this passage, it is undeniable that he is clearly dependent on Isaiah chapter 53. He's going to lean into Isaiah 53 language. And that's part of the reason that I wanted us to look at this tonight. Because if you've been with us in our previous Good Fridays, you know that since the beginning of our church, we slowly worked our way every Good Friday through Isaiah 53. 1 Peter 2 is the New Testament application and continuation of Isaiah 53. It's Peter taking up this idea of the suffering servant. It's him grasping even the words from Isaiah 53 and driving them into our hearts. We see that in our passage because he doesn't even name him Jesus. He names him Christ, the Messiah. For to this you've been called, because the Messiah suffered for you. Those are precious words. Christ also suffered for you. Do you value Christ's suffering for you? He suffered in your place. What if Christ had not been willing to be subject to unjust earthly authorities? Peter just told servants they needed to be subject to unjust earthly masters. We go like, that's a hard command. Some of you don't even like responding to your boss who isn't always unjust. Sometimes he's just cantankerous, or sometimes you just don't like him. But Peter's saying these masters were actually unjust, and you need to figure out how to live out graciously with them. But what we find out ultimately is Christ was willing to subject himself to unjust earthly authorities. He was subject to the Roman government. He was subject to the Jewish religious leaders. But what if he had not been? What if Jesus had said, I'm going to insist on my way. I'm going to insist on my rights. You can't accuse me of doing all these terrible things. I'm not going to suffer for doing something I've never done. Jesus had that opinion. He would have never gone to the cross. But instead, Christ suffered for you. Suffered in our place. Peter said, what credit is it if you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if you do good and suffer and you endure, that's a gracious thing. But do you know that word, when it says you are beaten for it, that's exactly what Peter's protege, Mark, uses. It's the exact same word that Mark uses in Mark 14:65 to describe what was happening to Jesus. Here's what Mark says in Mark 14, verse number 65. The high priest tore his garments, and he said, what further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? They all condemned him as deserving death, and some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy, and the guards received him with blows. Exact same wording of he was beaten. The story that Mark goes on, in the Gospel of Mark, the story of Christ's suffering is striking. At the end of Mark 14, Jesus endures the suffering of Peter betraying him and rejecting him. In Mark 15, Jesus endures the suffering of Pilate saying, are you the king of the Jews? And he says, you've said so. And then the chief priests accuse him of many things. And Jesus makes no further answer. Jesus endures the suffering of Pilate saying, who do you want me to release for you? And he was hoping that they would take Jesus instead of Barabbas. And they said, we'll take Barabbas. And Pilate says, what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews? And they cried out, crucify him. Jesus endured the suffering of Pilate saying, what evil has he done? And the mob yelling, crucify him. So Pilate wishes to satisfy the crowd. He releases them Barabbas and he scourges Jesus. And he endures that suffering, that unjust suffering. It wasn't right for Pilate to scourge him. He was not accused or convicted of a single crime, and yet Pilate scourged him. He whipped him simply to appease the crowd. And then he delivered him to be crucified. Jesus endured the suffering in Mark 15:17 of soldiers clothing him in a purple cloak and twisting together a crown of thorns and beginning to salute him, crying, Hail, King of the Jews. They struck his head with a reed, and they spit on him, and they kneeled down in homage to him, and they mocked him. And they led him out to crucify him, and Jesus endured that unjust suffering from Roman soldiers. They crucified him, and they divided his garments, casted lots for them. Here was the charge of his accusation against Jesus. He's the King of the Jews. There's two robbers, and Jesus endured the suffering of being numbered with criminals. Jesus endured the suffering of people passing by, deriding him, wagging their heads and saying, you destroyed the temple and rebuilt it in 3 days. Save yourself, come down from this cross. Jesus endured the suffering of the chief priest, mocking him, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Jesus endured the suffering in Mark 15:33. From the 6th hour, there being darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Jesus endured the suffering that led him to cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus endured the suffering of death. In verse 37, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And all of that suffering that Jesus was doing, he wasn't doing it because he had ever done anything wrong. He wasn't doing it for any disobedience or sin in his life. He was doing all that suffering for you and for me. That's why these are precious words when it says Christ suffered for you. The greatest injustice ever. He suffered for you. He suffered in our place. Christ suffered for you. These are gospel words. These are words for us to remember when we think about Good Friday, that of the many things that were happening, what was happening was unjust suffering. And we value Christ's suffering for us, even in his being mistreated, because he was suffering for us. Perhaps I've told you the story before about when I was a kindergartner, and God used a story that my Christian kindergarten teacher told that helped explain to me the idea that Christ suffered for us. She read this story. I've heard it other places as well, but she read the story about a farmer. And there was a fire on that farmer's farm, destroyed his barn, burned a lot of his crops, killed a lot of his animals. He came out after the fire and he was walking around in disappointment and disgust at seeing all of his place burnt, and he saw a pile of feathers on the ground, and he knew that it was one of his chickens, and in anger and frustration, he kicked that pile of feathers, he kicked that mother hen, and out from underneath ran a bunch of chicks. Because that mother hen had laid down on top of those chicks, and as the fire passed over, it killed the mother hen, but those chicks were able to survive that fire. Now, I don't know if that is fire accurate or agriculturally accurate. What I know is that my kindergarten teacher at school said, this is an example. If you want an illustration of what it looks like that Christ died for you, it's like that. It's like him spreading his wings over you, taking the wrath of God, the fiery punishment of God, and then you being able to live. He took your place. And I just know that even as a 6-year-old kindergartner, I could understand the idea. I never could have told you the word, but I could grasp what substitution meant. I could go, oh, he took my place. He covered me. He protected me. That's what it means when it says Christ suffered for you. He suffered in your place. Calvin said, nothing seems more unworthy and therefore less tolerable than undeservedly to suffer. But when we turn our eyes to the Son of God, this bitterness is mitigated. For who would refuse to follow him as he goes before us? Christ suffered for us. He suffered unjustly. That's why Peter makes this connection between the unjust suffering of Christ and how we endure our suffering. How we endure unjust suffering is a direct reflection on how we're doing it following Jesus. Because what Jesus did on that first Good Friday was to suffer, and he suffered unjustly. He did exactly what he calls us to do. He endured sorrows while suffering unjustly. And he did it for you, and he did it for me. We remember Jesus suffering on our place by looking at these words, but we're also going to remember tonight by celebrating the Lord's table, the Lord's Supper. So I want to invite you, if you are in Christ, that even as you have tried to give your attention to these words, you now give your attention to this table. This table is an opportunity for us to bring to our minds Jesus' body broken and his blood spilled. I'm going to invite the music team to come back. We're going to do communion just slightly different than what we would normally do. You're going to come, take both the bread and the cup. If you are in Christ, you are welcome to this table. And then you can go back and sit down because we are going to sing 2 songs. We're going to sing one song, and then we'll take the bread together once everyone has it. And then we're going to sing a second song. And at the end of that, we're going to take the cup together. So come, serve yourself or your family.